On July 9th, 2024, at 4:17 in the afternoon, Earl Braddock received a certified letter from a property management firm in Chicago called Lakefront Agricultural Holdings. The letter was one page. It informed Earl that the 400 acres he had been leasing on the north side of Gibson City, the ground he called the Engle Quarter and the Engle West 80, had been sold effective June 28, 2024. The new owner was an entity called Heartland Yield Partners, LLC, registered in Delaware. The letter stated that Earl's lease would not be renewed for the 2025 season and that he should contact the new owner's representative to discuss transition of the property. The letter did not mention the 400 acres of corn that Earl had planted on that ground in April. It did not mention the $147,000 in seed, fertilizer, herbicide, and diesel that Earl had already spent on the 2024 crop. It did not mention that the corn was at V12 stage, knee-high, healthy, on track for 220 bushels per acre at $4.30 a bushel. It did not mention any of that because the people who wrote the letter did not know what V12 meant, did not know what a bushel cost, and did not know or care that a farmer had $147,000 in the ground that they had just sold out from under him. Earl read the letter twice. He set it on the kitchen table. He looked at Ruth. Ruth picked it up and read it. She set it down and said, "When did the sale close?" Earl said, "June 28th. Ruth said, "That was 11 days ago." Earl said, "I know." The Engle ground had been in Earl's rotation for 22 years. He'd first leased it in 2002 from Marvin Engle, who had inherited the 400 acres from his father, Howard, in 1996. Howard Engle had farmed the ground himself until 1994, when a stroke put him in a wheelchair. He'd leased it to a neighbor for 2 years before he died. Marvin, who lived in Scottsdale, Arizona, and had not set foot on the property since his father's funeral, hired a Chicago property management firm to find a tenant. Earl was the tenant they found. The lease was straightforward. Earl paid $285 per acre per year, $100,000 to $14,000 annually, deposited quarterly into an account managed by Lakefront Agricultural Holdings. In return, Earl farmed the ground, maintained the waterways, kept the tile lines clear, and paid for all inputs. Marvin Engle received a check every quarter. He never called, he never visited, he never asked what Earl was growing or how the yields were. He cashed the checks. That was the relationship. If this kind of story matters to you, the kind where the people who work the land and the people who own the land live in different worlds, and the consequences fall on the one holding the invoice, we'd be honored if you subscribed. This channel exists because farming decisions carry weight that outlasts the season. There's no rush here, just the facts, told the way they happened. Earl had been a good tenant. In 22 years, he'd never missed a payment. He'd never been late. He'd improved the drainage on the West 80 at his own expense. $34,000 in new tile installed in 2011, because the old clay tile had collapsed and the field was holding water in the spring. He'd rebuilt the grass waterway on the North Quarter in 2016 after a heavy rain event eroded it down to the subsoil. That cost him $8,200 in seed, dirt work, and erosion matting. He'd never billed Marvin for any of it. He'd never even told Marvin about it. Earl considered it part of the deal. You take care of the land. the land takes care of you. That's how his father had done it, and that's how Earl did it. The tile project in 2011 was the one that still bothered Earl the most. He'd hired a drainage contractor out of Champaign, $34,000 for 12,000 feet of 4-inch and 6-inch tile, installed with a GPS-guided trencher, tied into the county main at the northwest corner of the West 80. Before the tile, that 80 acres yielded 160 bushels in a wet year, because the water sat in the root zone and drowned the corn. After the tile, it yielded 224. The drainage had added 64 bushels per acre across 80 acres, 5,120 bushels per year at $4.30 a bushel. That was $22,016 in additional annual revenue from that single improvement. Over 13 years, the tile had generated approximately $286,000 in additional crop value. Earl had paid $34,000 to install it. Marvin Engel had received roughly $252,000 in additional rent value from the improved yields, because Earl's rent was based in part on the productivity of the ground. And the productivity had increased because of Earl's investment. Marvin had never asked about the tile. He'd never seen the tile. He probably didn't know what tile drainage was. Ruth had calculated all of this one evening in 2019 when the rent renegotiation came due. She'd shown Earl the numbers, the ROI he'd created for Marvin's property at his own expense. Earl had looked at it and said, "That's farming." Ruth had said, "That's charity." She wasn't wrong. But Earl renewed the lease anyway, at $285 per acre, because the Engel ground was part of his rotation, and losing it would have meant restructuring his entire planting plan, his crop insurance, and his equipment utilization schedule. Sometimes you pay the price because the alternative is worse. The total Earl had paid in rent over 22 years was $2,508,000, $2.5 million. In addition, he'd spent approximately $34,000 on tile drainage and $8,200 on waterway repair, plus uncounted hours of labor maintaining fence lines, clearing ditches, and repairing access roads. None of that was recoverable. None of it was in the lease. None of it mattered to the people who had just sold the ground 11 days ago without telling him. Earl called Lakefront Agricultural Holdings the next morning. He spoke to a woman named Jennifer, who identified herself as an account coordinator. Earl asked why he hadn't been notified before the sale. Jennifer said the sale had closed quickly, and notification was sent as soon as the transfer was recorded with the county. Earl asked if the new owner intended to honor his lease through the end of the 2024 crop year. Jennifer said she didn't have that information. Earl asked who he should contact at Heartland Yield Partners. Jennifer gave him a phone number and a name, Kyle Pressner. Earl called Kyle Pressner. Pressner answered on the third ring. He spoke quickly. He said he was the managing partner at Heartland Yield Partners and that they had acquired the Engel property as part of a larger portfolio acquisition in Ford County. Earl asked if his lease would be honored through harvest. Pressner said the existing lease had terminated upon sale, per the transfer clause in paragraph 14 of the original agreement. Earl said he'd read paragraph 14. It said the lease could be terminated with 90 days written notice. Pressner said the notice had been sent on June 28th. Earl said he'd received it on July 9th. Pressner said the postmark was what mattered, not the delivery date. Earl said, "I have 400 acres of corn in the ground. I've spent $147,000 on inputs. That crop won't be ready to harvest until October. Are you telling me I have 90 days from June 28th, which puts me at September 26th? And I need to be off the property before my corn is ready?" Pressner paused. Then he said, "Mr. Braddock, the property has been acquired for repositioning. Our timeline calls for soil sampling and replatting in late September. We need access to the property by October 1st. Earl said, "You need access to a cornfield in October?" Pressner said, "We need access to the property." Nathan was in the room during the call. He was standing in the kitchen doorway with his arms folded and his jaw set. When Earl said, "repositioning," Nathan said, loudly enough for Pressner to hear, "He doesn't even know what's on the property." Earl held up a hand. Nathan went quiet, but he didn't leave the doorway, and he didn't unfold his arms. Earl said, "There's $378,000 worth of corn on that property right now. 220 bushels an acre at $4.30 a bushel across 400 acres. That corn will be ready the third week of October. If you take me off that ground before harvest, you're not repositioning an asset, you're destroying a crop." Pressner said he'd consult with his legal team and get back to Earl. He didn't call back that day. He didn't call back the next day either. Earl waited 3 days. On the 4th day, he called Pressner again. Pressner didn't answer. Earl left a message. Pressner's assistant called back an hour later and said Mr. Pressner was in meetings. Earl said, "Tell Mr. Pressner that my corn is growing at approximately 2 inches a day, that his October 1st deadline is 80 days away, and that Illinois tenant law says I have the right to harvest. If he'd like to discuss that, I'm in the field from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. every day." The assistant said she'd pass along the message. Pressner called Earl back within the hour. That told Earl everything he needed to know about how the conversation had shifted. But Pressner's position hadn't changed. He said his legal team maintained that the lease termination was valid and that Earl needed to vacate by September 26th. Earl sat at the kitchen table that night and stared at the lease agreement, all 16 pages of it, and read paragraph 14 for the 4th time. Ruth sat across from him with her laptop, searching Illinois tenant farming law. Nathan stood in the doorway, arms crossed, angrier than Earl had ever seen him. Here's what paragraph 14 actually said. It said the lease could be terminated with 90 days written notice, provided that such termination shall not take effect during an active crop season without mutual written consent of both parties. Earl had read that clause 22 years ago when he signed the lease. He'd read it every time the lease renewed, which was annually. That clause meant the landlord couldn't terminate mid-season without Earl's agreement. And Earl had not agreed. Ruth found the relevant Illinois statute that night. Illinois Compiled Statutes 735 ILCS 5/9-206.1 provided that a tenant farmer who had planted a crop in good faith was entitled to harvest that crop even if the lease was terminated, provided the tenant had complied with all lease terms. Earl had complied. His payments were current. His inputs were documented. His farming practices were standard. The law was on his side. Word got around, the way it always does. Tom Lindquist heard about it from Dennis Pruitt, who heard about it from the cashier at Casey's, who heard about it from Nathan, who'd said too much at the gas pump. By the following week, every farmer in Gibson City knew that Earl Braddock was about to lose 400 acres of standing corn because a man in Arizona had sold the land to a company in Chicago that wanted to run soil samples on a cornfield in October. The reaction at the co-op was predictable. Half the farmers were angry on Earl's behalf. The other half were scared because half the farmland in Ford County was owned by absentee landlords, and what had happened to Earl could happen to any of them. One farmer, a younger guy named Brett Schaefer, who leased 600 acres from a trust in Springfield, went home that night and reread his own lease for the first time in 4 years. He found a termination clause almost identical to Earl's paragraph 14, except his didn't have the mid-season protection language. He called Earl the next day and asked who had written Earl's lease. Earl said, "My father, in 1982. For a different landlord. I've used the same template for every lease since." Walter Braddock had put that mid-season clause in because he'd seen a neighbor lose a soybean crop in 1978 when a landlord sold without notice. Walter had learned from other people's mistakes. 22 years later, his clause was saving his son's corn. Earl didn't call a lawyer. He called Virgil. Not because Virgil knew anything about tenant law, but because Earl needed to talk to someone who understood what $147,000 in the ground meant. Virgil listened. Then he said, "You're not leaving that corn." Earl said, "I know." Virgil said, "What do you need?" Earl said, "I need to harvest 400 acres in 3 days." Virgil said, "Why 3 days?" Earl said, "Because Pressner's going to show up with a surveyor on October 1st, and I want every bushel off that ground before he gets there." The weeks between July and October were the hardest. Earl farmed the Ingle ground the same way he always had. Scouting, spraying, checking moisture, monitoring the weather. But every time he drove out to the North Quarter, he knew it was the last time. The last time he'd checked the waterway he'd rebuilt. The last time he'd walked the tile outlet he'd paid for. The last time he'd stand at the fence line where his father had stood in 2001, when Earl had first shown Walter the Ingle ground, and Walter had said, "Good dirt, take care of it, and it'll take care of you." Earl had taken care of it for 22 years, and now it was taking care of someone else. The corn came in the 3rd week of October. Earl started on the Ingle quarter on October 16th with the S680. Nathan ran grain cart. Tom Lindquist brought his S790 and started on the West 80 the same morning. He'd cleared his own schedule without being asked, told Earl he had 2 days he could spare and was going to spend them in Earl's field, whether Earl wanted him there or not. Dennis Pruitt ran a second grain cart. Wade Terschlusa sent 2 semis and a driver. Virgil came out to the field at noon on the first day with his service truck, checked the S680's belts and fluids, tightened a loose return line on the grain tank auger, and stayed until dark, making sure both combines ran clean. They ran from first light to last light for 3 straight days. Earl combined 14 hours the first day, 16 the second, 14 the third. He ate in the cab. He checked moisture on the move. Ruth ran the logistics from the kitchen table, tracking loads, calling the elevator to confirm capacity, coordinating the truck schedule so there was never a combine sitting full in the field waiting for a cart. She told Earl later that she'd managed more moving pieces in those 3 days than in any harvest she could remember. On the second day, a black Audi Q7 drove slowly past the field on the county road. Earl saw it from the cab. It slowed, stopped for 30 seconds, then drove on. Nobody got out. Earl kept combining. He didn't mention it to anyone until that night, when Ruth asked if Pressner had shown up. Earl said, "I think he drove by." Ruth said, "Good. Let him see what $147,000 in the ground looks like." In 3 days, they harvested 400 acres, 87,400 bushels of corn at 15.2% moisture, delivered to the elevator at Anchor. The yield was 218.5 bushels per acre. At $4.30, the gross value was $375,820. After Earl subtracted his $147,000 in inputs and his $114,000 in annual rent, his net on the Engel ground for 2024 was $114,820. It was his last check from that land. 22 years, $2.5 million in rent, $42,000 in improvements, and a crop worth $375,000 that he almost lost because a man in Scottsdale decided to sell and a man in Chicago decided the corn didn't matter. If you've made it this far, hit subscribe. These stories are told nowhere else, and they happen every season. Kyle Pressner showed up on October 21st with a surveyor and a soil sampling crew. Earl was already gone. The fields were clean. The stubble was cut. The grain was in the elevator. There was nothing left on the Engel ground except tire tracks, corn stubble, and 22 years of care that nobody would ever see again. Earl was sitting in his truck at the elevator when the last load crossed the scale. Nathan pulled up beside him in the Colorado. They sat there in the parking lot with their windows down and didn't say anything for a while. Then Nathan said, "That's the best corn that Fields ever made." Earl said, "Second best. 2016 was better." Nathan said, "You remember every year." Earl said, "I remember every field," and he did. 22 years of yields, stored in his head like a ledger that no one could sell out from under him. Pressner called Earl that afternoon. He asked if Earl had harvested the corn. Earl said he had. Pressner asked if Earl was aware that the termination date was September 26th. Earl said he was aware of what Pressner believed the termination date to be. Earl said his reading of paragraph 14, combined with Illinois statute 735 ILCS 5/9-206.1, entitled him to complete the harvest. Pressner said his legal team disagreed. Earl said, "Then have your legal team call my legal team." It was the first time Earl had ever referred to Ruth and a $35 a month legal database subscription as a legal team. But Pressner didn't know that. Pressner's legal team never called. The reason became clear 2 months later when Heartland Yield Partners filed their first soil sample report with the county. The report showed that the Engel ground, all 400 acres, tested at 4.8% organic matter, phosphorus levels of 42 parts per million, and potassium at 310 parts per million. For non-farmers, those numbers mean the soil was in exceptional condition. 22 years of careful rotation, responsible fertilization, and maintained drainage had left that ground in better shape than 90% of the farmland in Ford County. A land appraiser later told Earl that the soil quality on the Engel ground added approximately $400 per acre to the property's value compared to the county average. That was $160,000 in additional land value, created entirely by Earl's management, that Heartland Yield Partners had acquired for free when they bought the property. Earl had improved their asset by $160,000, and they hadn't paid him a dime for it. They hadn't even thanked him. Marvin Engel sold the 400 acres for $4,200 per acre, $1,680,000 total. He'd inherited the ground for nothing in 1996. He'd collected $2,508,000 in rent over 22 years. His total return on a property he'd never worked, never visited, and never maintained was $4,188,000. Earl's total return for 22 years of work was the right to farm it, the bills he paid, and a certified letter that arrived 11 days late. Earl doesn't talk about the Engel ground anymore. When someone at the co-op asks him about it, he says, "We're down to 1,040 acres now." He doesn't explain. He doesn't complain. He doesn't say that he spent 22 years building soil that someone else will profit from. He doesn't say that he improved the drainage, rebuilt the waterways, and left the ground in better condition than he found it. He just says they're down to 1,040 acres, and he changes the subject. Nathan asked Earl once if he was angry. Earl thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "I'm not angry at Marvin. Marvin's 78, and he sold what was his. I'm not angry at Pressner. He bought what was for sale. I'm angry that nobody in that entire chain of transactions, not the seller, not the buyer, not the management company, not the lawyers, thought to pick up a phone and ask the man farming the ground what was in it." Nathan said, "That's because they don't know what's in it." Earl said, "No, it's because they don't care." Ruth keeps the Engel lease in the filing cabinet. She hasn't moved it. When Earl asked her why, she said, "Because 22 years of work doesn't belong in the trash just because someone in Arizona decided to cash out." Earl didn't argue with that. He never argues with Ruth when she's right, which is most of the time. The Engel ground is still there. Heartland Yield Partners hasn't planted it yet. The last time Earl drove past it, the waterway he'd rebuilt in 2016 was already starting to erode. Nobody had maintained it. Nobody was going to. The tile he'd installed in 2011 was still draining clean, but tile doesn't last forever without maintenance, and the people who own the ground now don't know where the tile lines run. Earl does. He could draw them from memory. Every lateral, every main, every outlet. But nobody asked him, and he didn't offer.